Who can take a flower, roll it up and make it fine? Sprinkle it with knowledge and a little bit of time. Cover it with headlines and a sweet euphoria too. Cannabis man, can. Who can take a story and make it feel so grand? Spread the word around about the wonders of this land. Mix it all with laughter and a sprinkle of insight. Cannabis man flies. Ooh, Cannabis man, spreading news and joy across the land. Diving deep into the growing green. Cannabis man, we're all king. Ooh yeah. Ooh yeah. Ooh yeah. Cannabis man, spreading news and joy across the land. Diving deep into the growing green. Cannabis man, we're all king. Ooh yeah. Ooh yeah.
Ooh, yeah. Welcome into another episode of the Cannabis Man podcast. Thank you so much for clicking on the show. I am your host, Don Kleppen. And if it's your first time here, welcome. This is a show where we're taking a journalistic look, if we can, at all things cannabis as it becomes legalized medically and recreationally in states around America as well as the world at large. There has been a lot of change in the landscape regarding legal cannabis, but the debate is very much still ongoing. And I love keeping track of news stories in the space, any events, new states and countries that have legalized, what the results of that legalization are, and this sort of ongoing tug of war between those of us who want to see cannabis legalized and the prohibition ended, and those who are interested in maintaining the status quo. But there has been a heck of a lot of news so far this year in 2024, and there are some more news stories that I'm going to bring to you later in this episode, along with a guest interview, which is something I typically like to do on this show, speak with people who are in the space, if they are doctors, researchers looking to answer questions or prescribe cannabis medically for different patients, what they have found out, or business owners, entrepreneurs, people who have created either strains of cannabis or products related to the space, if those are new vaporizers, bongs, or experiences like a lounge or something where you can consume cannabis that is a brand new experience for people in this legal cannabis space. I also talk with government leaders, policy experts, people who are in charge of creating the legal framework for cannabis moving forward, or journalists and others like myself who cover this space, the industry, and try and bring different stories in it and catalog the different changes as we go, because history is changing all the time, and the press is a really important part of letting the world know exactly what it is that's happening at any given moment. If you would be so kind, please leave a rating or a review for the show, whichever platform you're listening to this right now on, if that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Earwolf, Downcast, Overcast. There are so many podcast platform options. However you're listening to this, or if you're watching this video on YouTube, click that like and subscribe button. And if it is Apple or Spotify, leave a rating for the show or a review. It helps me stand out from the other podcasts out there, and I'd really appreciate any kind of feedback you can give. You can also follow the show at C-Man Podcast on social media, Twitter and Instagram, and it's the Cannabis Man Podcast Facebook page and YouTube channel. You can always engage with the show there. I love reading the comments that people leave on the posts and the videos of the episodes. And you can always become a subscriber through Buzzsprout by clicking the support the show link, and that'll take you to a Buzzsprout page where you can sign up to subscribe for the show. You'll get a big email from me thanking you and your name shouted out in the credits of the next episode. And if at any point you hear something that I'm talking about, you have a question that doesn't get answered, or maybe you want to another topic explored, or you have a suggestion for a guest I should talk to about something, scroll down and click on the Text Cannabis Man link in the description notes right below the artwork for this episode and the title. If you click that text link, You can write a message. Do me a favor and let me know which episode you're listening to and what topic you're talking about. But then you can just let it rip. If you disagree with something I say, if you feel like a guest has it wrong, or if you just want to say, hey, keep up the great work. Love hearing from you, and texting the show is a great way to do that. As I said, I've got a lot of news to get to and a whirlwind. As I said, I've got a lot of news to get to as well as a guest interview, which I'm very excited to share with you. This is a book that I just finished reading, and the author, it's his first book that he's ever written, and it's a story of his own life. It's semi-autobiographical, and the book is such a fascinating snapshot of what the cannabis climate was like in America back in the 60s and the 70s, and this guy became a big-time smuggler. He grew from just a student at UC Berkeley, discovered cannabis, went on his own journey, and through that journey ended up becoming somewhat of a big-time smuggler, bringing batches of cannabis over the Mexican border. And he just has so many fascinating stories, and the book is just such a vivid picture of what the climate was like then, and his story is something that I'm fairly confident will be made into a movie one day. So we've got all that and more coming up on this episode of the Cannabis Man Podcast. Here we go.
This is Tommy Chong, and you're listening to the Cannabis broadcast.
Welcome in. Thank you for joining the show. I always appreciate you listening, because obviously if you're not listening, then this is completely meaningless, and I'm just here spouting into the void for no reason. So thank you very much for being a part of this. I love it. And I'd like to start this episode off by jumping right into the News Joint Wrap. This is a wrap-up of news stories and events related to cannabis in and around Illinois, and it's all curated for you by IllinoisNewsJoint.com. You can think of it as the joint you can hit for all your Illinois cannabis news and reviews, and some of the news this week has to do with a record set by the state of Illinois relating to cannabis items sold so far this year. This was published by Jason Brown on June 2nd, last weekend, from when I'm recording this, which is June 6th. IDFPR, the state's Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, announced last week recreational cannabis sales totals for April of this year. And in that post, Illinois, it was revealed, sold a record high number of cannabis items in April, although the sales totals were lower than March. The record that was set by Illinois dispensaries includes 4,140,350 cannabis items, which were sold in the state in the month of April, with totals of those sales reaching $144,511,466.85. Of those sales, in-state residents accounted for $111,504,000, and out-of-state residents totals reached $33,006,571. Jason notes during the first 2 years of legalization in Illinois, April and the 420 holidays boosted monthly totals to outperform the surrounding months, but for the last 2 years, April totals have seen a drop compared to March and May. Although March sales totals outpaced April, the amount of total cannabis items sold has increased for that month. And then Jason goes down and gives a specific breakdown of the rest of the months from 2024, as well as the months from 23 and 22. You can go all the way back to 2020. And as Jason notes at the bottom, the figures do not include taxes collected. Those are calculated separately. And then another piece of news here, Canopy USA is closing in on an acquisition of Acreage Holdings. As Jason notes, Acreage Holdings, Inc. is a vertically integrated multi-state operator of cannabis cultivation as well as retail facilities in the U.S., and they reported earlier this week On June 4th, my sisters Melanie and Megan's birthday, happy belated birthday, Mel and Meg. On the 4th, there was a report of a series of corporate actions from Acreage Holding. Those include the exercise of the call option to acquire all of the issued and outstanding Class E subordinate voting shares of the company in accordance with the arrangement agreement between Acreage and Canopy Growth, which was dated back to April 18th of 2019. Jason gets into some of the weeds, the very legal language that is in this open call here to acquire all the fixed shares. But what it basically means is that when these acquisitions close, Canopy USA will own 100% of the outstanding and issued shares of Acreage. Some conditions still need to be met, and the closure will complete during the first half of next year, 2025, following the receipt of the required regulatory approval. So there are still a few steps here, but the major thing to note is that Canopy USA is about to own all of Acreage Holdings next year, provided that everything continues to be approved and move forward as it was set forth. Now, the CEO of Canopy mentions that there's part of this that has to do with debt restructuring and some efforts on Canopy's parts to reduce costs. And I've talked about it on the show, and I'm sure you've heard it elsewhere too. There have been some surprising bankruptcies in the legal cannabis space over the last few months. One of the highest profile of those would be MedMen. Some of those dispensaries have been shuttering all around Illinois, and MedMen was one of the first legal cannabis companies established in the U.S. once it went legal. So it was definitely something surprising, even to those of us who are covering the space. Like a lot of other industries out there, and just kind of like this point in history that we're at, a big part of the whole game when you're starting businesses, in fact, some would argue like the biggest part, is consolidation. What's happening in pretty much every field of every business and industry that's out there is that you create a product or a service. You make a company. You go out there, you start doing what you're doing, and basically what the end goal might be, not for everybody, but what tends to end up happening is that whether you want it to or not, if you do something that's good enough and makes enough waves, one of the big sharks is going to come along and just buy you up and either merge your smaller company with their larger operations or just purchase you outright, and then you'll be a branch of their larger company. See OpenAI with Microsoft, or LinkedIn with Microsoft, or so many of the companies that Amazon or Apple have bought up over the last couple of years. And it's not just tech that this happens in. It happens with restaurants. It happens with gyms. It's happening all over the place, especially in America. And it's unfortunate, but it does feel like with legal cannabis and these giant multi-state operators that are popping up, we're just going to see more and more of this consolidation and these purchases, assets, mergers, acquisitions. We're going to see these things which are pretty typical of corporate America. They are going to be more and more common in the cannabis space too. But you can find out more about that, as well as a few events which I'd like to bring up, one of which is an announcement from Can-O Comedy by our friend Stoner Natalie. She's a friend of the show. She was on a while back. Definitely recommend checking out that episode if you haven't. But Can-O Comedy is going to host a summer edition event, which is scheduled for Friday, August 9th at Molly's Joint. It'll run 5 to 10 p.m. It's at 2 Donna Drive in Tilton. You can get tickets as well as more information about the event, which includes a complimentary beer and wine, live jazz, infused foods and drinks, and 3 to 4 comedians who will perform for about 2 hours. You can get more information about that event as well as others and some great reviews, which include Butter Stuff Infused Pre-Rolls by Ozone, Hybrid Keef by Paul Bunyan, The Glove by New Era, and more, all at IllinoisNewsJoint.com. And before I get to my guest this week, listener, I want to tell you about my strains of the week, what I've been smoking on this week, and they are courtesy of my friends at the Wrigleyville Sunnyside Dispensary. Always love giving some love to them. Every time I go to that dispensary, I have a fantastic experience. I don't know if you've gotten your medical card yet, listener, but I always tell people, I advise people, especially in the state of Illinois, you really owe it to yourself to get that med card, whether to save money on the taxes or save some time. Dispensaries like the one in Wrigleyville can get very crowded, and those lines can stretch out the door around the block. And if you'd rather not spend an hour standing in line like it's Six Flags just to get your cannabis, I cannot recommend getting a med card enough. You get that VIP treatment skipping those long lines a lot of the time. And boy, ever since I've done it, it is definitely the best purchase I've made in the last few years easily. But anyway, the strains of the week that I have been on this week are some pre-rolls, some shorties, dog walkers. They are of the indica variety, and this strain name is Tide Pods. Pretty hilarious name. I had to laugh when I saw it, and there's something satisfying about telling people that I'm smoking on some Tide Pods, given how kids were eating them on that TikTok trend a few years ago, which wasn't really funny. I know kids got poisoned and hurt. I'm not sure if anybody died, but that, I think, is where this strain takes its name from. And regardless of whatever the name is, you know that I am more of a sativa kind of guy. These indicas, I really love the vibe that they provide. I've been smoking on them on various days. It's been a pretty long stretch for me doing some double shifts. These indica shorties are actually kind of helping me, not all day by any means, but, you know, around this 3-4 o'clock time, around 4:20, I usually love to step out and smoke on any day when I can at that time, and I've been hitting these Tide Pods, and they're giving me the exact vibe that I'm looking for. Just a little bit of taking the edge off, making me feel better about stuff, and I've been splicing that with some sativa flower that I've ground up and I put in my dugout that I bring with me to my work shifts, as well as, you know, just kind of stepping outside at night when I am at home. I go down by the water, meditate a little bit, and I either light up one of these Tide Pods joints, or I have some of this sativa flower Lemon Daddy from High Supply. There was a great deal I got on it, $25 for the eighth. As I say, you can often find better deals when you buy in bulk, but that often requires spending a little more money, and this time the Tide Pods as well as the eighth of the Lemon Daddy all ran me at the Wrigleyville Sunnyside about $90, and that the pack of pre-rolls of Tide Pods, that's a 12-pack, and they are shorties. It's a 4.2 gram package total, so all of these shorties have about 0.3, 0.35, something like that of cannabis inside them. So 12 pre-rolls of shorties and then an eighth of Lemon Daddy sativa flower for $90. I was pretty satisfied with that. And that is one of the reasons why I head to my Sunnyside locally, because I find that they have some pretty decent deals, and they are not paying me to say this. I am not being compensated. I'm just telling you how I see it when I'm looking for good deals. And I'll talk a little more about this because prices have, it might not feel like it, but prices have in fact been coming down in Illinois because of the competition that's been increased as more dispensaries get their doors open, get more products on shelves. Prices have been coming down, and there are some good deals out there to be had, and I tend to find those at Sunnyside. Listener, I am very excited to bring to you this conversation with my guest today. He has a really fascinating story to tell, and we are all very lucky that he has now told it officially in a new book that just came out about a month ago, April 20th, very fittingly. And the book is called The Next Run, a UC Berkeley student's rise to major 60s pot smuggler. And it's a fast-paced book. It is very readable, and it's full of these details that really richly paint the journey that he went on personally, as well as painting a picture of what the cannabis scene was like back then, and kind of giving us a glimpse, you know, those of us who maybe have only, if you're young enough, listener, you might only know like a semi-legal environment if you're living in the U.S. or whatever. This really kind of shows, this book gets into how anti the establishment was against cannabis, and I just can't wait to hear from him himself telling us a little about some of the great stuff that's in this book and just kind of answering some questions as to what it was like smuggling cannabis over the Mexican border and kind of getting a little operation going here, you know, as organized as crime could be from a college student. But it was very, very fascinating to read, and I'm very excited to bring to you this conversation with my guest, Tom Jenkins. Welcome, Tom. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
I really appreciate you coming on today. And I just wanted to jump right in because I just finished the book. And it took me a while to get through. And the reason it did is because it is so full of rich details. And I want to maybe just start by asking you about that. When you were writing this book, did you find that a lot of these memories were there, easily mined by you, or did you talk to some of the people who were going through this with you and kind of asking them the questions about what they remembered and stuff like that? How did this go for you?
Okay, I can tell you how it went. What I did is when I got out of the business, I actually tried to get into medical school and didn't get a place, so I decided I would become a writer, and I wrote up the entire experience while it was still fresh in my mind. And my writing sucked at the time, but I got all the facts down, and that proved invaluable. So I didn't need to ask my friends, most of which are dead, unfortunately, about their experiences. I was able to simply refer to the manuscript. And at this point, I still have some clear-cut memories of those times, but some of the memories are just mixed up with my recording of the facts.
Sure. Yeah. I can imagine that. And that's a cool style, as you said, to write down immediately what you had remembered. And I got to say, I was really impressed because this, it's the narrative of the book is straightforward, but you do a lot of planting in certain scenes and really giving certain details, like exactly what kind of food you and your friends were consuming at the time. A lot of mention of freshly squeezed orange juice, and just different stuff like that. People that you met, what the order of conversations went, and kind of whether you felt sort of friendly toward those people right away, or if you got a weird vibe from them, and then you kind of had to either overcome that, or they maybe proved your instincts about them right, depending on how the scene went. I just gotta, I want to ask you now. We're sitting here and it's 2024. We're recording this at the end of May. And, the DEA, I've been talking about it a lot on the show. They just made this announcement to reschedule cannabis down from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. So they're admitting that there's medical value. They're admitting that their policy over the last 50 years was full of folly, let's say. And I'm just reading this book from you and reading all of your journeys of just from your first run to how you grew the operation, from going in cars to then with planes to scoping out different planes to taking out the seats so that you guys could get as much supply, on the run as you possibly could. What is it like for you to write this story and put this book out, but then see the reality of what the change in the attitude toward cannabis has been, even from the federal government?
Well, that's an interesting question because I was influenced by the negative attitude towards cannabis during the time I was operated. And so when I got out of the business, I considered that I had done something really good. And then I ended up working in an area where professionals in the area had grows. And I thought, well, wow, I forewent, gosh knows how much money to leave this business. And here I'm seeing my superiors doing similar to what I was doing. So that was a bit of a shock to me. But the attitude has changed so much, and my attitude has changed as a result too.
Really? So that's interesting. And I'm glad you said that, because I noticed in the book there were times when, you talked about how you had some success, and then you're still making runs, but you kind of made made a personal decision to stop using cannabis, to stop smoking grass, as you put it in the book. And then you were in classes at the time. You were kind of focused on, it seemed like, getting back into high school, getting your GED that way. But then after a while, you got some more free time back, and it seemed like you went back to smoking grass, as you said, and just kind of getting back into not just necessarily the party scene, but kind of being okay with consuming more. And I'm interested in your perspective. It seemed like you maybe went back and forth a little bit throughout your journey here. And I'm just curious, where do you stand now? How do you feel about cannabis now? And, do you use it for anything?
Okay. The way I feel about it is this. It did me a tremendous amount of good. So I can only assume it can do that for other people. I had what you might call an inadequate childhood. So by the time I was a teenager and nearing becoming an adult, I wasn't really prepared to be an adult. I had lots of problems, and I kept them buried. I was kind of in a state of denial, and I was a pretty unhappy kid. So when I first started smoking pot, it just took all the pressure away. And once the pressure was relieved, then I wanted to find out more about why I was feeling the way I was, what had gone wrong with my childhood and everything. And as is mentioned in the book, my friends and I would read Freud and a lot of other authors as well, and would psychoanalyze each other on grass high. And I just learned so much about myself during that process. Then, as time went on, grass didn't do that much for me, and I haven't really smoked it much in a very long time. Although I've got to say, I had a wonderful time a few years ago at a friend's house. I was with the right people, and grass being something of an aphrodisiac, the setting was right, and I had a great time. I don't smoke it that much anymore. If other people enjoy it, I think that's great. And if other people can have the experience I did in getting relief from really what was mental illness, then that would be super.
Yeah, right on, and very well said. A lot of cool stuff in there, Tom. I totally get your point, and I agree with you about that, the healing nature of cannabis. It's I was just mentioning the rescheduling thing. That's basically an admission from the government itself that there's medical value to the plant itself, and whether we're talking about mental health or if we're talking about things like chronic pain, physical maladies, stuff like that, there is a lot of good that cannabis can offer. And I also take your point that it's sort of like, your level of consumption of it, mine as well, it changes over the course of years. I mean, there was a time in my life when I was smoking all day, every day, and that's certainly not the case now. But it is something that I'll still lean on from time to time. There's these great drinks that have hit the marketplace, things that are like light beers, but they're seltzers with like 2 milligrams of THC. There's some gummies that, can help sleep or whatever. So, and as you said, especially if you're social and you're in that right set and setting with the right people, that's when it's most compelling, is when you're, socializing and you're with a group that maybe makes you comfortable enough to slip into an altered state and then just kind of keep the party going in that fashion. So I do totally agree with you there, but I'm so fascinated by the notion of you guys kind of psychoanalyzing each other. And as you said, you do discuss it in the book, how you and your friends were reading Freud and reading the psych texts, and then you'd smoke and have those sessions, and it's like you wouldn't just, it's not like you were smoking and then just like, enjoying the food or the drink around you. You were actually diving pretty deeply into how our brains work, and you were kind of taking what you were learning, all of you, from these books you were reading, and you were putting them into practice by turning that lens onto each other and yourselves. And I can only imagine that really, as you said, that really helped you through some difficulties from the childhood and maybe kind of turned your compass or your lens forward as to where you wanted to go next. Is that fair?
It certainly is. And regarding the effect of pot on people, I think it's so very complicated and varies so much from individual to individual that it needs to be studied. And so hopefully with this reclassification on the part of the DEA, we can do more research into it and learn more about it. Just as an example, I have two people very close to me who are daily pot smokers. One of them, you would never know it, just sharp as a tack. The other one has really lost her judgment and become rather befuddled as a result. So it can vary. Same thing, the brother of the woman who is sharp as a tack is a daily smoker, and he now has COPD, which is chronic lung damage.
Oh,
and
yeah.
requires oxygen. Whereas his sister it has got great lungs. So there's tremendous variability, and it really needs to be studied in depth to find out, what the true benefits and risks are.
Yeah, you're so right, and I mean that's a great point. And thanks for giving those examples too, because I think that when what you just spelled out, how difficult it is to really pin down, especially when you're talking about medical advice, when people are giving it as medicine, it's like it is so different from person to person. And you talked about siblings just now, where a brother, has had one effect. His lungs are not great with it, whereas his sister, her mind is great and she has great lungs and is a daily smoker. That just illustrates how different the reactions are from person to person. And as you say, I know that my friend Paul Armentano at Normal talks about we know a lot about cannabis over the last 30 years, but at the same time, because of the restrictions on research, because of the limitations of federal funding, there are still so many questions. We might know in terms of like its potential harm, like when you compare it to alcohol, we know enough that it's like, okay, it's not that dangerous. Or with other drugs, let's say like opiates or something like fentanyl, we know it's not that potentially harmful. But at the same time, what it does to one individual versus another, I know I speak all the time on the show in my own life. I use it and I have a tolerance or constitution where it doesn't impact me mentally in terms of preventing me from doing things that I want to do. But I've got, my brother himself, he's tried it a bunch and it's just not for him. He gets a totally different reaction from it, and he doesn't, it's just not his vibe. He doesn't really love it. And there are many other people in my life, my friends, who we party together, whether it's drinking or just hanging out without any substances, but they look at my use of cannabis and they go on their own experiences and say, I don't know how you can possibly do that and function, because their reaction to it is very different from my own. And so what you're talking about, Tom, the variability from person to person, I think that's part of why it's been so difficult to really get our arms around this as a society and kind of give a blanket policy regarding, who can use cannabis, who it's okay for, who should avoid it, that kind of thing. And the only answer to it is more study. And thankfully, we do seem to be moving in that direction with federal funding and maybe the DEA finally getting out of the way and letting people do that. On that topic, Tom, I was just, as I was going through the end of the book, you get to a point in the book where you talked about this operation under the Nixon administration. Operation, I can't remember what the title of it was, but it was really when they cracked down on the smuggling.
Operation Intercept.
Thank you, Operation Intercept. That was it. And I was going through that and just, you at this time in your journey, you had partnered up with Bruce. You guys had been doing plane runs for a while, and you seemed to have it down to a science. And I'm just wondering, what did you feel like when you heard that from the sitting president, and knowing that, okay, now it seems like all the resources of the federal government have gone, they're now focusing their microscope right on what I'm doing. How did that feel for you at the time?
Well, it was rather frightening. And I wish I hadn't tried to outsmart him on that occasion because it didn't work out very well. Not to reveal too much, but it was frightening to think that what we had been doing so cavalierly for over a year was now suddenly under the microscope.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And you also, again, I don't want to reveal too much. The book is fantastic, listener. Again, it's the next run by Tom Jenkins here, talking about his journey in smuggling, cannabis over the Mexican border. And I don't want to reveal too much, but there is a chunk of the book where you do finally get arrested and you spend some time in a Mexican jail. And I found that section of the book to be very insightful because you talked a little about you and the guy that you were in there with, and you reflect a little about what freedom you had enjoyed between the two of you guys now had been taken away as you're sitting in this cell. And there's a moment when you talk about, you guys are discussing what you want to do when you get out and how good it's going to feel to just be free and be out, and something you didn't appreciate before. And you almost kind of predict in a very prescient way. You talked about how you thought even once you guys got out of there that you still would feel the same, that you wouldn't necessarily still appreciate the freedom that you had realized that you'd been taking for granted before. And I'm just kind of curious, now you're in a very different stage of your life, a lot of time's passed since then. Is that attitude, that idea of taking freedom for granted, or just the sweet stuff of life, do you still feel that way, or have you found ways to kind of appreciate it and anchor yourself in those really happy moments?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question completely, but I'm going to answer it by saying I very, very much enjoy my freedom at this point in my life, and I look back and think, what was I thinking to risk incarceration? I don't think I would have done well. As a physician, I've worked in hospitals where I treated prisoners, and I would see them dressed in orange, shackled, and think, wow, there but for fortune go I.
Right.
And I think I would have been very miserable as a prisoner. And sometimes I think I have a mild form of PTSD. Because I sometimes I think back to the risks I took, and I just shudder in fear, just thinking that I went through that. How could I do that?
Yeah,
so I have a very different attitude.
Yeah, I can only imagine, and I think that that makes a lot of sense to me too, because I think that journey you took, and even in that moment when you were spending in the Mexican jail cell, and the whole time that you were doing these runs and smuggling and whatnot, you were at a point in your life, it just timed out, where you were young. And I say young being that kind of like late high school, college age, from the late teens into your 20s. And I think that to me, and I'm sitting here, as somebody who just over this weekend turned 37. So I'm in a different stage of my life and moving into a different one too. But I can remember that late teens, early 20s phase, and I know I certainly did stupid things that I shudder at thinking of even right now. There was I used to go climbing when I'd go camping with my friends. We'd go rock climbing with no equipment. They called it cliff scrabbling. And the only reason I stopped was because I fell like 50 feet in this ravine in Wisconsin. I broke both my wrists. I fractured my skull. And that is something that I still think about regularly as like, that could have been the end of it for me. And why would I do that? Why would I even risk that? But I think that it's just, I have come to think of it as just, that's a part of our development. There's a period of our lives when you're just out of adolescence. You kind of have that feeling like you're invincible, like you're going to live forever, and that the consequences that happen to others won't happen to you. And I just feel kind of like your journey through that life period had this excellent historical tie-in with the smuggling. And so I know what you mean about the shuddering and kind of thinking very differently from where you are now, but I really do feel like the reasons, or maybe why you did that, is very relatable, and I think that comes across in the book as well. I feel like we all go through a little bit of that developmental phase, and I just think yours was very cinematic in the way that it ended up happening.
Yeah, I think we're sort of hardwired to be somewhat fearless as we enter our reproductive years. That's probably, built into us as a result of evolution.
Yeah, that's a great point too. I think that, it makes a lot of sense. You'd have to be on the more fearless end of the spectrum to be going out and, whether it is just meeting new people for the eventual act of procreation, or even just leaving home in order to seek out new lands and then meet those new people in order to eventually do all of that. I do think you're probably right there, that there's an evolutionary element to that sort of that psychology that we have. But on the note how cinematic this is, Tom, I'm curious, is this your first book that you've written? Have you written anything else?
This is it.
Man, because dude, this is a really fantastic book. I read a lot, and first-time authors and everything else, this does not read like that. This is, as I said, it's narratively, it's compelling. I never got lost in it. There's a lot of detail in there that makes the pictures vibrant in your mind. I felt like I could almost smell the ocean when you're talking about, being on beaches in Mexico, trying to wait and find these contacts that you had been, told about for your next run. There were a lot of moments in the book that I felt like I was just right there. And we're talking about this period of life where we're in that just out of adolescence, we're entering our reproductive years, and that feeling of being in college, being invincible, and feeling like the consequences don't matter or whatever, I felt like reading this book really took me back there. And I'm just kind of curious, have you thought about, if this gets made into a movie, have you thought about anybody that you'd like to play you?
I'm not up on modern actors, but I would imagine whoever the young version of Matt Damon would be the person to play it.
Nice. Right on. Yeah, I could see that. I was, as I was reading it, I'm kind of thinking any young version of Matt Damon's a good call. I think maybe right now it seems like I would guess Tom Holland, maybe Austin Butler, the guy who just played Elvis, or maybe Timothy Chalamet, who was in the Dune movies. Those are some young guys that I could see kind of being you and playing this journey. You did mention, and it's unfortunate, it's been a long time since this journey you took that you talk about in the book, and you made a lot of connections through this enterprise that you went on, and you mentioned that a lot of them are gone now, which is unfortunate. It's just an unfortunate part of life. But for any who aren't gone, you mentioned at the end of the book that you bring up a lot of names. In the epilogue, you say that a lot of names are brought up, and if anybody reading the pages recognizes themselves, that you want them to reach out. I'm curious, have you, since the book's come out or as you were writing, have you spoken to anybody from this time in your life? Or since it's come out, has anyone reached out to you and, maybe taken you up on that party offer?
Not yet. I sure would love to hear from so many of these people. The book has an amazing number of minor characters. I don't know how many, but I would guess probably 70, 80 minor characters here and there. And I lost touch with most of them. It's a funny thing, at the time, I just thought those days were going to last forever. So I didn't bother keeping people's numbers when I met interesting people. I didn't bother taking notes. I didn't take photographs. I only have one photograph of myself from that era, and only 3 photographs of my contacts. And that is it. That's all the photographs I took during that 10-year span, which is kind of too bad in retrospect. But that was the nature of the time, that I just thought it would go on forever, so I didn't feel a need to bother recording anything.
Totally. Wow. Yeah, that is, I totally feel that same thing with you too, though, because I think that it gets back to that period of life that we're talking about where you're in developmentally and you just think that it is going to go on forever. And I get that. I was the same way, just going through, coming up through radio and meeting a lot of interesting people, but I also just didn't really keep numbers or whatever because I felt the same. I felt it was going to go on forever. But it's a really cool book, and you say that there are 70 to 80 minor characters, and that gets back to part of the detail that you really layer in throughout this entire story. And I just found myself enthralled scene after scene, even as the story changed and you were, things would, whether it was when that Operation Intercept started or whether it was, when you went back to school after you had started smuggling and all of these things, when your journey changed and you went into different chapters, you still found ways to lay in a lot of detail, so much so that, like I said, it really just kind of transports me there. And for a first-time writer, I was just really, really impressed with how narratively well thought out this book is. It's easy to follow. It's straightforward. And like I said, the way you paint the picture with the details really brings the reader into where you were. And I'm just looking forward to more people reading this book and just kind of taking the adventure with you and kind of seeing some of these minor characters that you do such a great job of bringing to life for these future generations. I wanted to ask, Tom, where's the best place that people can get this book, The Next Run, that you've got out now? Amazon. Nice and easy.
I do have a website, and it's thenextrun.net. And there should be a purchase button there, but Amazon's probably the easiest and most direct way to get to it. Regarding my writing, I'd just like to mention two things that helped me get to where I am in terms of my ability to write. One is that I simply read, I think, 100 to 200 first-person true accounts just to see what made them work and kind of dissected them. And I read On the Road 15 or 20 times. To me, On the Road is like a poem almost, and I get something new every time I read it. The other way I learned how to write, and this is going to sound strange, but I come from the days when we physicians hand wrote our notes. And I really put a lot of effort into my notes to really capture the character of the doctor-patient interaction I had just had. And I think the precision that medicine demanded made me a much better writer, and that I learned a lot simply from writing so many notes.
That's a really cool note. I'm glad that you mentioned that, Tom, because that is fascinating. I think it sort of almost gets back to how you learned in your story, like just the art of smuggling and how to go on these runs. It seems like you did it by trying it out for yourself, but also getting into the nitty of certain others that you witnessed, doing it, or other people at the time crossing the border. It seemed like you really just kind of dialed in on the details of what was being done, and then you put your own spin on it. But what mattered was the mindfulness and the thoughtfulness that you kind of put into your way of doing it. And it seems to me that is probably part of what lent itself to your success doing that, as well as clearly what has been a successful shift into writing as well. Because again, I'll just say that I think for someone who hasn't done this before, this is a hell of a coming out party. This book, The Next Run, is really a joy to read, and it was hard to put down, as I said. But what I liked when I did put it down was the lingering impressions and feeling like I was at those places that I had just read about because of the details that you layered in. And I'm just really glad that you wrote this book, because I'm somebody who's fascinated about cannabis. It's what made me start this show, and not just, the personal benefits and all that, but, kind of looking at the societal changes. Obviously just 50 years ago, the Prohibition, but then what that looked like here in this country and around the world, and then looking at this day by day right now, seeing different states and then different countries outside the U.S. legalize medically, as well as the adult use markets. It's just incredibly fascinating to me to watch this collective shift, like changing of the mind, not just from an individual, but from a culture at large. And it makes me wonder, you have mentioned, and you mentioned in the book, that you decided to pursue medicine after you made the decision to leave that line of work of smuggling, and your life moved in a different direction, and you've obviously been fully engaged in that since. I'm curious, I'm not sure where you're based at now, but do they allow medical cannabis there? And is that something that you have in now your medical career? Is that something that you bring into your patients as well? Have you ever prescribed anybody cannabis?
Yes, I have. I have not recommended cannabis to people. Well, one time I did. Oh, this is kind of a funny story. I practiced for a while in Mendocino County, which is part of the Emerald Triangles, so to speak, of Northern California.
Yeah.
And I had a patient that just was kind of wasting away, and we couldn't figure out why. And I sent her to Stanford, and they couldn't figure out why. And she wound up in the hospital again, and I was taking care of her. And I mentioned to a friend, I ran the case by him without mentioning her name, of course. And he says, well, has she tried pot? And I thought to myself, what an idiot. Why didn't I think of that? So I go back to the patient, and there's 2 beds, and there's a curtain preventing me from seeing the woman in the next bed. But I can hear that woman speaking with her husband. So I felt kind of embarrassed asking my patient whether she had tried pot or not. So I said it in a low voice. She didn't hear me, so I had to raise my voice, at which point the conversation next door just came to an abrupt halt. So they were clearly listening to everything I was saying.
Right.
And my patient said, yes, she had tried it, and yes, it had stimulated her appetite in the past, but she hadn't tried it recently. So I said, well, do you know where you can get a hold of maybe some pot brownies? Well, at that point, the husband of the woman next door steps around the curtain holding a tray and says, we have some pot brownies here.
Oh, my God.
And that is Mendocino County for you. It is a county based on pot.
Oh, my God. That is a hilarious story, Tom. Like, that you just worked yourself up, or that you got this reminder, like, oh, yeah, like pot might be a solution here. And then you're in the process of recommending it. And not only is, just someone next door know where to get it, but they have it right there, exactly what's needed. That is really hilarious. Do you know did the patient you were talking to, did she just take one from the tray and then just start going right there?
Yes.
That is awesome. That is wonderful. And that Emerald Triangle, as you say, that Mendocino County is, that's a special place. I know that I've been finding this, the way that we do legal cannabis here so far with the patchwork, state by state, and there's no interstate commerce. Like, it's not as if people can legally ship, cannabis grown in one part of the country to another, although it does happen. But I'm really looking forward to, when it's decriminalized fully. I'm sure that this rescheduling is not the end of this journey. And when it is at least decriminalized, or the federal government gets out of the way and states can kind of send products to one another, I think what's going to end up happening is that Mendocino County, that Emerald Triangle, is going to be shipping a lot of its cannabis to a lot of different states, just because it truly is the best that's out there, it seems like.
Well, what I'm afraid of is that large corporations will just take over. I'm hoping it becomes like craft beer and like wine, where all sorts of little people can get involved and contribute. But I'm worried, just based on what I've seen so far, that a few big corporations are going to muscle in and make it very difficult for the little guy. And in fact, that's already happening. A friend of mine who has been a grower for decades tried to go legal when California legalized it. He spent something like $150,000 getting his water tested, environmental reports, this and that and the other thing.
Right.
And the labeling, the weighing and the constant testing was so burdensome that he gave up and went back to the black market. And not only that, but this absolutely boggles my mind. He signed a contract with a Sinaloa cartel.
Oh, man.
And he's in Mendocino County. Or I'm sorry, he's in Sonoma County, actually.
Okay.
And he said they offered him, first of all, part of the contract is he sells them all the pot. They supply the seeds. He gives the pot back to them, and they're offering a price that's something like 30 or 40% higher than the free market price, which I have trouble understanding.
Wow.
For wholesale. So that's where he's at. I think I think he's nuts to be dealing with those folks. But he's so far he's still alive.
Yeah, Tom. I'm glad you shared that, man, because that is, I think it really gets at a larger issue at play here, which I know many of my listeners, I know many of the people I talk with in the cannabis space, they share your fear. And the story that you just told illustrates kind of exactly why people make that choice. It is, I mean, don't get me wrong, it is hard to understand why someone would like willingly sign up to deal with a cartel, that, especially the Sinaloa cartel, like that. It seems like you're kind of, trying to get a handshake with a shark, right? Like it just seems like you're signing up for some, potentially dangerous stuff down the line. But what you just talked about, Tom, all that, the headaches and all of the runaround and the hoop jumping that we have to go through, the burdens that a lot of people, especially private business owners or like small businesses who are trying to get up and running in legal cannabis, they find those burdens to be too much. And the fact that the black market still exists, and I know that different states are like kind of dealing with this, some more than others, but they talk about how as well as legal cannabis is doing in some states, the black market still dwarfs a lot of what the legal action is. And it's crazy to know that these cartels are still basically operating on a case-by-case basis. But as you say, even though it's dangerous, I can understand why somebody might make that choice just in terms of what's more realistic for them in terms of getting their business up and running and not needing to kind of go through so many hoops and deal with so much regulation on the part of the government. It's just a shame, and it feels like unless we make some change like that decriminalization or, removing the federal government from this equation, it does feel like that dream, like you just described, of making it more like the craft beer scene, where people can, if you make a good batch, that can launch a brewery and they can actually then get up and compete with the bigger guys. A big corporation might buy you out, but you at least can still play in the same field as them. And I agree with you. I really hope that we can get there with cannabis as well, because otherwise it feels like this legalization journey is just going to be short-lived. You know what I mean?
Right. And, speaking of the cartels, I just want to make the point that when I was in this business, they didn't exist, at least to my knowledge. And I actually had contact with the two biggest dealers in all of Sinaloa. And since Sinaloa is and still is the biggest drug dealing state in Mexico, I assume these dealers were as big as they get. Their names were Manuel and Modesto. And
right.
As far as I know, they weren't a so-called cartel, but I guess they were probably the precursors to the cartels, because they did have men working underneath them. And for all I know, maybe they were the seed of the Sinaloa cartel.
Wow. Yeah, I remember those characters that you just mentioned, going through them in the book, and I remember your interactions with them. You sort of noted their vibe, which was with the person that you were with was obviously different than those people that you had dealt with before. And kind of talking about like knife scars and different stuff like that. That has to be really. I can't imagine how that sort of must feel for you. You already talked about how you're kind of like, you shudder to think about those days, but I can only imagine that adds to it, just thinking that the guys that you'd had some interaction with may be, and I would agree with you, they may have very well been like the predecessors to what is now the Sinaloa cartel. Because if they didn't exist then, I'm sure those guys that you dealt with were as close to it as one would get.
Right. And regarding those two, an interesting point about my book is those two could have stepped straight off the pages of Breaking Bad, but no other characters in the book are like the characters in Breaking Bad.
Right.
The book is very upbeat. Most of the people in the book are quite honest. There's some exceptions, of course, but a lot of them are very honest, a lot of integrity in those days. And I actually like to think of my book as Unbreaking Bad because it's so different.
I love that. And I'm glad you said that because you're right. Those two examples, they do kind of remind me of, like, a listener, if you know Breaking Bad, like the character of Tuco, kind of the, not rambling, but a little bit, off the rails dealer who would kind of snort the meth right there in their meetings. As you say, Tom, maybe those two guys you could draw a parallel there, but nobody else is like that. There's no Jesse Pinkmans, there's no Walter Whites. There's nothing like that in your book. And I really love that you just said the Unbreaking Bad, because it's a little like that. It's so cinematic in its own way, your book, but it's such a different journey. It's like the opposite of a journey of like what Walter White went through with Breaking Bad. But if you enjoyed Breaking Bad, listener, if you kind of like that vibe, you will definitely appreciate the next run, a UC Berkeley Student's Rise to Major 60s Pot Smuggler by my guest today, Tom Jenkins, which is available, as he said, at Amazon. So go ahead and get yourself a copy, because this is a story that is absolutely worth reading, and I know you're going to enjoy it just like I did, and you'll probably get transported to some of the scenes that Tom spells out for us right in those pages. Tom, listen, man, I could talk with you all day. I love hearing your stories, and I hope you continue writing, man, and I look forward to the day that your book gets made into a movie. Keep doing what you're doing, man, and thanks a lot for telling your story.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
And there you have it. I want to thank my guest, Tom Jenkins, author of the book, The Next Run. You can get that on Amazon whenever you like, which means you might be able to get that via drone. I don't know if you heard that, but they just got an expanded license to use drones to deliver packages. So that'll be kind of an interesting thing to look forward to. Very futuristic world we're speeding into here. Tom asked me to mention that he would really love to hear from anybody who he mentioned across the pages of the book. So if you recognize yourself in the pages, if you know somebody who you think it might apply to, he'd love to hear from you. And we were talking after the interview, and he was very, very interested in the prospect of the story being made into a film. And so if you or anyone you know has any connections to producers in that effect, he'd love to hear from you as well, or you can reach out to me. I'll put you in touch with him. But I certainly think that this book was written cinematically, and it was very, very easy for the movie to run in my head. And I think it would make for a great movie for anybody who's interested in doing that. Taking a look at some national news stories worth your attention. This first one gets back to something I talked about earlier in the episode. I mentioned Illinois set a record for how many cannabis items it sold. Well, this article from the Marijuana Herald goes further, saying that $170 million worth of legal cannabis was sold in Illinois in April. So that record amount of items equated to that much. And the second part of the headline is this: prices reach record lows. So this article is going further into the same one that Jason wrote for Illinois News Joint. This one at the Marijuana Herald, though, is focusing on a different part of this equation. Of that record amount of items sold, only $169.6 million, which obviously is still a lot of revenue. You might be asking, if you're an Illinois consumer, how could they have sold a record amount of items without also breaking a record in terms of money? And that has to do with the prices reaching record lows. The article by Anthony Martinelli goes, in April, the average price per gram of recreational cannabis was $9.16. setting a new record low. Similarly, the average cost per gram of marijuana concentrates also reached a record low of $58. So I know that I mentioned this several times over the course of the show. You may have heard me bang this drum before, but I always said that once more competition entered the marketplace, that prices in Illinois would come down. And we did admittedly have to wait a little longer than some other markets to get there, which means that some of us had to shell out some extra money that, we really shouldn't have, which is annoying. This is not a sprint necessarily. This is more of a marathon. And legal cannabis is probably never going to be perfect, but that also means that it can always get better. And I believed that it was always going to. And specifically concerning the prices, Illinois are still very high, probably higher than they should be. But as you can see, the come down is real, and it's happening now. And that means that Illinois, as I've always said, I think is likely to settle into this place in the middle of the road where prices may not be as low as some of the markets that have gone bust, but there is also incentive that remains for good business owners and product creators to provide high-quality goods and services to the people of Illinois for a fair market price. They can make their profits. We as the consumers don't have to shell out more than we should. They will find the value. The market will find the value now that there's real competition among more and more dispensaries, and it's not just the early MSOs that sort of dominated things that are going to be setting the tone for everything. This is great news, and I look forward to continuing down this line. Another facet of the cannabis industry, legal one anyway, is workers voting to unionize, which more states have seen happen in recent weeks. An article here, MJ Biz Daily, published last week, May 31st, updated June 3rd, so Monday from when I'm recording this. Marijuana workers unionize in Denver, Las Vegas, and Maryland. The article starts, marijuana workers continue to unionize across the country with the latest pacts reached in Colorado, Maryland, and Las Vegas. Interesting that they shifted to the state titles down from the headline in the main body, but except for Las Vegas, not mentioning Nevada, it stays Las Vegas because that's the thing that we know. Bud tenders and shift leads at the Ascend Cannabis store in Aberdeen, Maryland, voted overwhelmingly to join International Brotherhood of Teamsters Local 570, becoming the first Maryland cannabis retail workers to unionize. Numerous Ascend customers supported workers during the organizing drive, donning Vote Yes buttons inside the store during the lead-up to the vote, according to a press release. Las Vegas workers at cannabis product manufacturer Canna Punch Brands voted to join the United Food and Commercial Workers Union Local 711. That's a 32-member unit, and they're the first cannabis processor in Nevada to vote to join the local 711. And then, meanwhile, a 19-member team at the Silver Stem Fine Cannabis Retail Store in Littleton, Colorado, voted to join the UFCW Local 7. Okay, that's not Denver, but even so, I suppose that's not entirely inaccurate. They did say Colorado at one point. Voting to unionize is the beginning of the contract negotiation process, which can take up to 15 months. That is the conclusion of the article from MJ Biz Daily. I've linked both of these articles below. You can read more about this for yourself. Another article from MJ Biz Daily, Joe Biden's drug czar hints at interstate commerce if cannabis is rescheduled. Now, this is something that I have talked about on the show for a while and looked forward to for some time. The idea of interstate commerce. And that is something that some of my guests have talked about in terms of a business perspective. You know, if you're an investor at all in cannabis, if you've thought about it, if you're looking to, the notion of interstate commerce, as well as the rescheduling and, you know, hopefully ultimate decriminalization of the plant, that is going to lead to a lot more freedom in terms of business, both transporting of products and just these markets being able to operate somewhat like the rest of the regular markets do in the country. And that includes being able to collaborate with businesses across state lines and have national brands truly grow. We've seen that already with some of these hemp products and some of the beverages that have gone state by state. Those have been a roaring success. And as I've talked about on the show before too, I think that's going to expand. Now you're going to see a lot of the cultivation centers that were built up in certain markets that maybe have to contend with conditions that are not as friendly to growing high quality product as in places like they are on the West Coast or in Hawaii, let's say on Maui. There are places that have just specific conditions where if you just throw a seed in the ground outside out there, what's going to come up and grow is likely going to be better and higher quality than a lot of places with indoor grows and certainly outdoor spots in other parts of the world just cannot hope to compete with. And with interstate commerce, that's going to mean that farms that are located in places like the Emerald Triangle, Mendocino Valley, like I was just talking about with Tom, these places as well as Maui, like my cousin Nate growing out there. You know, when interstate commerce becomes a real thing, that's going to allow for operations that are set up in the places that make that high quality cannabis easily. A free market, these businesses elsewhere, when they can legally and maybe somewhat cheaply, certainly cheaper than setting up your own cultivation center, you can just ship that high quality stuff from there to you wherever you are. That is going to be very big for the state markets, for those businesses, for us as consumers. Because now, instead of just, you know, when your dealer is lucky enough to get some high quality stuff to give to you, now you're going to be able to reliably get that at your local dispensary or a lounge where, you know, you can hang out for a couple of hours, or a bakery or any of these infusing operations. They'll be able to make some edibles or high quality concentrates using the best flower that's out there. So interstate commerce is something that I have looked forward to very, very enthusiastically. Now back to the article. These comments from the drug czar came in a recent interview with the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Dr. Rahul Gupta, who I've mentioned on the show before, he's the officially titled Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. And he also hinted at a timeline for when cannabis might officially make the move from Schedule 1 to 3 under the Controlled Substances Act, which I've speculated about on the show in terms of I thought maybe I was hopeful that maybe it would be done by the end of the summer. That was optimistic, and it turns out that Dr. Gupta here says rescheduling is a process that will continue to go on for the remainder of the year. And, you know, I did mention that once the independent review was a possibility, the timelines of which nobody really has any control over or idea for, it's an unfortunate reality of this legal process. But as I've also mentioned, public comment period is open until July 22nd. I linked to the page where you can read everyone else's comments as well as leave your own. That was in my last episode's description notes. You can check that out anytime you like. After that, though, the article reminds us the timeline is not entirely clear. Observers have speculated that a final rule could be issued as soon as September or October, which it's true. I mean, just even because the drug czar says that this will go on for the remainder of the year, you know, nobody knows the future. It's always fluid. It's entirely possible, though maybe not likely, but it is possible that this could be wrapped up sooner rather than later, sooner than expected. But even so, it's a pragmatic thing to say, and for somebody in the White House to issue a pragmatic statement rather than put out a timeline that is too optimistic and then has to walk back those comments in a couple of months, I'm fine with it. But he goes on to talk about how important it's going to be to removing barriers to critical research and maybe drug development, as well as benefits of medical cannabis. He declined to get into questions about legal access and commercial opportunities. But he does note that Schedule 3 drugs are generally lower priority for law enforcement. I've linked that article below. By all means, check that out as well. And one final note, which I thought was really, really worth celebrating. I want to end on a high note here. Huge milestone. This article from thebusinessofcannabis.com has a headline that reads, huge milestone as Japan moves ahead with cannabis reform. This was published on May 31st by Ben Stevens. The article says Japan's officially launched a public comment period for its landmark cannabis reform bill, offering new details on how its nascent cannabis industry will look over the coming months. Most notably, the article says the preliminary proposals suggest Japan is seeking to forego the complex and lengthy novel foods process for CBD products and could become the first country to approve CBD in food. That would be a major development. I mean, to be the first country to legalize CBD in food and, of course, drink, you know, the beverages that come with that, that is major. And, you know, Japan is a huge leader in that part of the world. I mean, China, obviously their economy is a dynamo, but Japan is a major cultural leader, and they have a way, their education is top-notch, top of the world. A lot of their engineering, their inventions, they are top quality as well. And for them to do something so progressive, though, is really, really interesting. progressive concerning drugs, concerning, the legalization of any substances that, even though CBD, as we know, is not mind altering, it's in the cannabis plant. It's under that umbrella. And so to even be kind of in that realm, I think that is pretty progressive for a culture like Japan's, and it's fantastic. So that's just some exciting news. I wanted to share that with you. It really just gets back to the overall momentum worldwide. It's people are watching what's happening here in the U.S. and whatever country you're in around the world, though. I mean, even though the different states, it's been interesting, the conflict, it's kind of been playing out under this roof of America, among the states back and forth, but it's also playing out in other countries around the world, but they're just doing it, countrywide, whereas, the U.S. is still kind of lagging on that federal policy front. Although, again, as I just said, in a couple of different ways, the steps forward are happening. Maybe not as fast as some of us would like, but the movement is going. And to see moves like this from Japan, from Germany, from the Ukraine with medical, as I've talked about, Thailand is kind of flip-flopping. And that is going to happen. It's human nature to kind of swing between the guardrails a little bit. And I think that those sorts of behavioral corrections are just to be expected. And ultimately, I believe Thailand will go back the other way, and they will go back to fully recreationally legal too. But to have countries like Japan, like Germany, like the Netherlands, geopolitically, people watch what these countries are doing. And, whether it's for the new revenue, whether it's for the medical benefits, whether it's for just sort of the freedom knowing that people of your country want it, it's really great to see these countries actually doing steps. It's not as if, and even like the U.S., it's not even just that they're decriminalizing these things. Some of them, are actively legalizing it. And it's really remarkable. We do live in very interesting times. I mentioned, earlier about the Amazon drones and kind of air delivery. Next year, here in Chicago and in other cities around the country, there are going to be flying taxis getting people to and from airports from cities. I mentioned that United has bought some of those, and they're going to debut them here in Chicago in 2025. So people are going to be going from the West Loop up to O'Hare Airport in like 20 minutes via air taxi. So we got drones delivering packages. We're about to have flying cars, and countries like the United States, like Germany and Japan, in 3 different parts of the world, but all leaders in different respects, to have them legalizing cannabis in which ways they do, more so than just medically. People are paying attention all around the world. These signals are not falling on deaf ears. And it's just, things don't always happen this fast. They haven't. And, I get it when some people argue that it's too fast. I mean, it's certainly a lot to keep up with. And it can be hard to sometimes feel like you got both feet on the ground and you're sort of sturdy. But in the case of cannabis, at least, this is something that people have been clamoring for decades. This is a 50-year prohibition in this country. I've said a lot recently on the show. 5 decades, a whole generation of people that, like is talked about a lot in The Next Run that Tom Jenkins and I were talking about earlier. The different ways that cannabis has been prohibited, has been kept down for really even more than the last, certainly 5 decades, but since it was made official. But 1937, way back then, that's really when the sort of prohibition started. And so think about all of the Americans that have come and gone in that time between then and now, and whether they knew it or not, their lives may have been, I'm not saying it's guaranteed, but they may have been seriously improved. The quality of their life may have been improved a lot by cannabis and legal access to it. And if society had just kind of allowed it to naturally progress the way that alcohol has had, or maybe even normalized it, and absorbed it and promoted it as much. Even half as much, my God. Like where would cannabis be now if it had just been allowed half of the, warm embrace that alcohol has gotten? It's certainly something interesting to think about, and that is what makes me really, really happy, just that we are moving forward so quickly. I say on the show a lot that I can still so clearly remember a time. I'm somebody who's been using cannabis for going on 20 years. It's approaching that mark for me, and so that's more than half of my life, and so it's I can remember very clearly being young, discovering this, going on my own stoner journey, and discovering what this offered me in terms of quality of life improvements in important ways, like getting to sleep. And another element of this that I've mentioned lately a lot is that where cannabis does become legal, where the prohibition does end and it does become normalized, and kids grow up in those worlds, in those cities, in those societies, where cannabis is not prohibited, it is just there, offered, and it's normal. That does more to end the stigma, truly, than anything else. And that is among the most exciting parts of this. All the quality of life improvements and all of that ending of the stigma, which is going to allow so many more people to even just consider the possibility of experimenting with it. That is so much a part of what makes all of this very exciting to me. So I hope you're excited too, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend, or whenever you're listening to this, evening, morning, rest of your day. Go spend some time out in nature, give somebody that you love a hug, let them know how you feel. And next time you find yourself in a nice moment, close your eyes and just take a deep breath and kind of anchor in it. Try and just sit down and let the moment slow down around you. I've been finding that really has a big impact on the rest of the day and the mood. And, I think just life is a collection of moments as well as connections with people. And so when you've got those two things, rolling around, especially at the same time, try and stretch those moments out as long as you can. And remember to follow the show at C-Man Podcast on Twitter and Instagram, the Cannabis Man Podcast Facebook page and YouTube channel. Leave a rating or review for the show on whichever platform you're listening to this, and become a subscriber by scrolling down and clicking on the Support the Show link and signing up there. Hit the text link and let me know any of your thoughts about this episode or any guests that you want to hear me have on. I always love any of the feedback that I get from you, and thank you so much for listening. And I'll be back again next week with another episode of the Cannabis Man Podcast. Bye-bye. Cannabis Man is 100% originally crafted by myself, Don Kleppen. Original theme music written and composed by Yusu Kim, aka Good Son.